literary and other background resources or themes that run through the work. I was very struck by a comment that he made when we were having a private viewing of the show earlier this week, when he said that for him, the main sort of dynamic of making his art is to achieve a fresh encounter every moment with the materials. So I'm painting for you a picture of a person who is in direct, almost, there's a language and there's a conversation going on between the material and the artist that is pretty powerful. I was saying to him, would you go so far as to say that you go into a trance when you start to go deeply into the process of making? And it's not a word he would have used, but he said there's some truth to that. Here's how it's going to go. You're all standing, and so I want you to reassure you that this isn't going to go on endlessly. There'll be a formal and an informal part for those of you who have to leave. So what I'm going to do is spend 5 minutes or less just sharing some of my thoughts and perceptions of the work. Then Juan is going to talk with us all about 4 or 5 key pieces that are all around us that we can look at together that make it easier to understand some of the things that are important to him, and also some of the great stories and personal anecdotes from his life that really make the experience of looking at the work that much more real, more relatable, and more powerful. So in no particular order, just a couple of thoughts. I was very struck by the fact that the forms and figures in many of the pieces in this show are paradoxically coming together and coming apart or falling apart, moving apart, all in the same piece. There's an example of that right there, this sort of the figure that has 2 halves. There's a great example right immediately to the towards the window, the next piece. The figure that has 2 heads and then the body on the left, it's called Waiting for Godot 3. Waiting for Godot 3. See how there are 2 heads, and then the figure on the right seems to have a full leg and part of a body, and the figure on the left seems to be either decaying or coming apart or maybe coalescing to form another whole entity. I'm very struck by the rich suggestiveness of that process, that gestalt of flux. It's one that I associate with my Tai Chi Taoist adventures here in Toronto as a practitioner, with the yin-yang principles of growth and decay and perpetual change. I also was very struck with the ideas that many of the bodies have a fragile quality to them, either because they're very attenuated and thin, or because they appear to have been split asunder, fallen prey to the ravages of gravity, environment, time, history. This Air of Sierra, I hope, which is the title here on the right, is one that I think of when I say that. In looking at the work, I thought of the inevitable falling away or diminishment of flesh and bones on the human body. Another couple of thoughts, transcendence. Now, we had quite a lively discussion about this idea. When I look at the figures, especially the ones with their eyes raised heavenward, there are a number of them where the heads and eyes seem to be inclined upwards. When I look at those, it reminds me of the Taoist belief that humans are meant to be essential conduits between heaven and earth. Juan is not overly enthused with the idea that they're looking to the heavens for guidance or spiritual direction. We don't want to be that literal, but I do find that other concept very powerful, that our reason for being here in this world is to connect heaven and earth, however we might interpret that in the broadest sense. I absolutely loved the meditating figures. These are masterpieces. And while I talked about other figures looking heavenward, these figures are looking kind of in an unfocused way outward. And I'm going to ask Juan to tell the story about how these figures were created. It's quite a charming one, and you won't forget these works once you hear the story. I was struck by the groundedness of the figures. I've just been talking about them looking skyward, but virtually every figure, less so in the more recent works, which are in a different direction, the more recent works from Mexico. But in the earlier works, you'll notice that they are very firmly situated on the earth. In fact, the plinth or support is built right into the sculptures, and it has kind of a clay-like, soil-like quality or finish in many cases. I am struck by his new direction, which involves ideas of dynamism. The newest Feathered Serpent works, and I'm anxious to hear what he says to you about them, because I'm still processing what's going on with those works that were coming into the gallery just as I was about to leave on the other day. Drawing and linear gestural feel of the work. Now, Juan does ink and charcoal drawings, is that correct, on paper?
Ink and
brush?
China ink.
China ink.
Rice paper. On
rice paper drawings. Not as direct images or plans or diagrams to make works from, but to get at some of the feelings and the sort of, why do you do, what is the relationship between the drawings and the sculptures? It's something I didn't ask you last week or earlier.
It's basically a process of getting me out of this world.
Getting you out of this world. So it's almost like a five-finger exercise, like a pianist does, just to relax their hands and their mind and get into the zone. That's fair, I get that. But I was very struck by the idea that in some of these sculptures, like the ones with the multiple figures, where a lot of the material, the clotted, congealed, clay-like bits have fallen away, that it's almost like you're seeing in the wire armatures underneath, or the wire elements, lines, like drawn lines. I mean, you could see them as drawings in three-dimensional space. I don't want to make a big point of that, but it's something to think about. That is just about it. We thought that we would spend about 15 minutes with Juan talking about individual works. Could the people at the back just move in so that newcomers can actually get into the gallery? Thank you very much. There's lots of space, a little closer, not past that bench, but up to there, says the videographer. I'm all for us having a big huddle up here, but I guess that's not going to happen. So it's my pleasure to turn things over to Juan. And Juan, I'm hoping for the benefit of all of us that you could talk about your process and circumstances in creating some of the works that really get at the heart of your decades of practice. Juan.
How do you put this work?
Okay, so you're good. You put it right over your mouth like that, and just go. Yeah, you're good. So speak now, and well, you tell us if you can hear him. It's really important that you hear him.
Okay.
Maybe I'll turn
I
you
know
up a
why
bit.
I was.
There.
This is why I guess I was so nervous this morning. I have to make this talk.
He just doesn't want to look like Madonna with that hair.
When people ask me, what do you think is a good artwork? How do you distinguish good artwork and not so good artwork? To me, there are only two criteria. One is the piece, whether it's painting or sculpture, whatever, the piece has to have its own life. It has to stand its own feet and talk to us in their own language. Not in our human language, but its own language. So when I create my work, I'm listening, but I'm not in a human terms. Human language is so corrupted. It's basically a system of power through the language that capitalism perpetuates its own purposes. That's our human language that put us in a box that society wants us to live in. But artist has to give the viewer something other than that. So artist has to continuously open a new door and go to new places and encounter chaos every time. So that connects to my second criteria of good work, is that even in a split second, the piece has to give us some sort of feeling of the possibility of different world. Not in this world that we are supposed to live in with, by structuralists. We're all structured, basically. We're not even subject I doesn't even exist. It's all social structure. Well, everybody has different opinion of that, but at least as an artist, it's something that that we have to constantly encounter new territory of chaos and bring something fresh out of that chaos and to bring that into our work. So hopefully that when we see something beautiful, something outworldliness of artwork. So well, that was at least my intention. So in my process, I disappear, model disappear. It's just a piece, and my hands and my eyes, they're completely somewhere else in trance, and until the piece comes, talk to me in the loudest terms that, okay, I'm done. Okay, so we had enough conversation today. You're tired, your bag is early. Stop now. Then I stop. Okay,
so I don't know about you, but I would like to hear more about the meditators. And luckily, that's the biggest duo of works in the show. So even though you're at the back,
you can see the works or get the general idea. So you can see there are two figures, cross-legged, striking different poses that I recognize from my Qigong practice. And could you tell us how these monumental figures came to be?
Yeah, this came to me in a sort of incredible way. Back in 2005 or 2006, I was doing a workshop in China, Dalian, in the foundry factory. I invited two Canadian sculptors. Is Brad there?
Yeah.
Brad. Yeah. Brad was one of them. And
so we can cross-check the story with you. see which details they brought.
Who else was there, Hinju?
Kemi.
Cami, another Sculptor Society member. Cami couldn't come today because she had another wedding. Cami and the American, what's her name?
Lydia.
Lydia, and the Chinese sculptor friend of mine who arranged all this. So the Brad and other artists were using a bigger studio, working together with the one model, and as always, I had to work alone. So I was working in the small little studio with the model, and I was working all morning, and it was about 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Brad and his group let this other model go, and she was bored, so she came to my studio, and she was talking with my model, and they were chattering away, and at the time, I didn't understand one word of Chinese. I am now a little better. But they were talking, chatting for almost half an hour non-stop. So I started to kind of irritated me. So I don't know what got me to say to them, let's do meditate. Meditate is in Chinese is Cha Sun or something like that. So somehow I managed to convey the idea of doing the meditation. And this too goes incredibly, this is a very abstracted form, but the position they took is exactly like this.
I think they were teasing him a bit. They were going, "You want meditation? Well, here we go."
No, they were quite serious.
Were they?
They were.
Yes, I did. That was a question I had. Were they sort of exaggerating just to make the point?
It was incredible. It was around 3 o'clock in the afternoon. The sun was shining in from outside, and it was a very hot summer day. And the whole 2 girls meditating, and the whole thing just struck me. Like it was a new, fresh encounter. So I stopped my piece that I was working on, and I told them, "Stop, keep going." And then I was making amateur like crazy, and 2 hours this came by. I was working, so it was like almost in trance, like 2 hours. A small piece like this came about. So and once I start working, of course, the position they took inspired me, but already they don't exist. I don't exist. My hands and the moments flow, and it just, yeah. So I don't know how this came about, but that 2 hours I was not there, and at the end, okay, it's here.
This is the peak experience that every artist prays will happen to them at certain stages in their life. Also, there's another word that we use in Tai Chi. I don't know why we're getting feedback all of a sudden. I'm going to move a little bit further away from you. It might be the other mic on your lap. No? It's the idea of entrainment. Entrainment. I've just learned the word quite recently, and you made me think of it just now with what you said. It's when you get utterly in sync with other people when we're practicing, or with your materials in the case of this rather extraordinary experience that you just described. Any questions or comments? I was going to say that for the end, but anything that everybody, I mean, we have lots to share with you. It's just, are you okay for another couple of minutes to talk about another work or two? Yeah? Is there any work you particularly want to talk about? I mean, I have ones that I was going to propose, but what are you feeling today? Yeah? So, Kaisura 3?
Oh, okay.
So that's this one, right? Or no, it's this one, further over, the 3 figures, right? Yeah. So this work, I was very struck by the circumstances. I'm going to stand up, maybe it's just where I'm sitting. The circumstances under which this work was created. I was shocked to hear that 8 years ago when Juan, was it the very day that you created the smaller version of this work, or this actual work? This actual work in his Guadalajara studio. Can you guys move? Oh, there's room there for people to get in. He had a terrible accident. He fell off the scaffolding that he was working on in his studio and ruptured his spleen, which can be fatal. He had a very close brush with death, and I wondered, after learning about those circumstances for this piece, I was very struck by the title as well. Caesura, it's the Latin word C-A-E-S-U-R-A. I hope I'm pronouncing it correctly. It stands for, and I got this from Juan, a cut or break in time. And I can only imagine what a cut or break in your lifeline, that accident, felt like, and how close you came. And Juan shared with me something very beautiful, and he'll expand on it. The idea, Caesura is a break in time from the chronos, which is earthly time, and the eons, A-E-O-N, or E-O-N, which is cosmic, eternal time. Juan, would you care to say anything about the work as it relates to that watershed time?
Also, Caesura represents some major events in history.
Ah, okay.
So it's a very coincidence that I was concerned with time, and difference and repetition is also concerned with time. but particular in Kasura series, I was more concerned about time, how time moves on, this chronos and aeons.
Can you put your mic just a little bit more in front of your mouth? Thank you. Bless you. Yeah, sorry. Very good.
So it's the last of Kasura series. It was my last day of staying in Guadalajara 21st Century Studio. And Francisco, the director, specifically asked me the day before, why don't you make a 2-meter size? You know, I was making about this 1 meter 20 years, so why don't you make a 2-meter size? And I said, do you think you can cast that if I make this thin pieces in 2 meters? I said, sure, I could do that. So I could, okay, why not? So next day, he gave me all wires and supplies and all that. So from the morning till about 5 o'clock, I created this one, and I finished, and I was absolutely exhausted. But Francisco was an ambitious guy. He wanted to have meditators in 4 meters, and to
4 meters.
to install on a boulevard, a large boulevard on Guadalajara in 21st Century Studios name. So he had all the 4-meter frame and everything. After finishing that, I had this Hyunju's instant four noodle. I remember that. And then Francisco brought me about 3 workers, supposedly to help me to get the meditators finished. I was really tired. I didn't want to do it. But since people were there, maybe I should. But Francisco set up scaffoldings around this sculpture, and I wanted to test that. And I got up there. It kind of looked okay, but it collapsed.
It wasn't okay.
It wasn't okay.
So not okay.
So there's just one last point, and then I think we're done with the formal program. Those of you who want to stay and ask questions directly of Juan can do that. I'm mindful of how you're all packed in there like sardines into the gallery. The last point I wanted to draw out of Juan vis-a-vis some of the symbolism, and he doesn't like that word. He doesn't think it in symbolic terms, he told me, but some of us do. Some of the works that are split or fractured. I really enjoy the work really the oldest work in the show, if I'm not mistaken, right inside the front entrance. So those of you near the front door, finally you get a good look at something that we're talking about. It's the figure of the man, it's a person with very large, sort of a woven body shape and the small head, this one here. So those of you closer to it will notice, come on in. Can you guys just move over a tiny bit? There's one other person out there in the wilderness trying to get in. She's leaving, she couldn't face it. You'll notice that there's a crack, two big cracks in the shoulder piece. Now on the side closest to me, there is a fissure, which was intended by Juan. An opening that helps you feel that there's an interior life, an interior space inside the figure. But the cracks were accidental, Juan, right? And could you talk about how something that could have been an annoying glitch to your vision for that work has become quite a central precept of your work? The idea of the flaw, the crack that leaves space for other things to come in and go out. Could you? And there is, by the way, I think Juan, if I remember correctly, you commented that this piece here, Air of Sierra, has a similar kind of thing. He didn't like the way the sculpture was going. He was starting to take it apart, and you actually cleaved it apart. You were going to dismantle it. But once it got cut asunder, Then all of a sudden he realized now there's life in this work. Any comments?
That's exactly right. And yeah, a lot of my work, accidents, I call them happy accidents. And I embrace those accidents into my work. And sometimes those accidents give the work the life that I wanted to share. Like waiting for Godot number 3 there.
Yes.
I didn't like, I finished the whole piece the way I intended to do, but it didn't speak to me. It was numb. So I didn't like it at all. So I started tearing it down. And then all of a sudden I took a whole bunch of clay off it, and then it started talking to me. So wow. That's how it came about. So those accidents and those dismantling sometimes without my intentional forming of forms, forming themselves, this unformedness sometimes informs me much more than forming.
So you heard that. The unformedness informs the work. There's a lot of forms. More than the form. Now, if you can say that fast, you get a special drink at the front. Just go and say hi. So, do you agree that we should probably conclude, unless there is a question or two that you really would like to share with everybody? Otherwise, we'll conclude the formal part of this program. Anything anybody was wondering, Jay? Anything you wanted to add?
I think that was brilliant, and I think that it gave some good insights into the actual working process. That was really interesting. Thank you, Betty Ann. She was absolutely delightful. She's a great agent. Everybody feel free to come talk to Juan and ask questions individually if you wish. Thank you.
And what a turnout.